In this video lecture, we'll discuss how natural and sexual selection drive the evolution of behavior. Some key points to remember about natural selection is that natural variation exists in the population before there's any natural selection pressure. Under certain environmental conditions, a variation in the population increases the probability of its survival. With increased lifespan, there's an increased probability of finding a mate. And the more mating events that it engages in, there will be an increased probability of creating offspring. The more offspring, the greater the probability of passing on the characteristic to the next generation, and gradually over time, the population begins to change. So, just as with any sort of other characteristic, there's variation in behavior within a population. So for example, we can look at foxes. Some foxes are very aggressive to humans, some foxes are very afraid of humans, and some foxes are relatively docile to humans. So what scientists did in Russia was they took some of the docile foxes and mated them with other docile foxes. And over a number of years, through artificial selection, they've created foxes that are pretty much domesticated. You could have one as a pet. This is only possible because there is already variation that exists within the population before the artificial selection pressure was applied. The same could be said for tigers. Most tigers like to have a territory. They spend most of their time in their jungle where it's easier for them to hunt. But every now and again, there's a tiger that displays some variation. An example could be increased aggressivity. And then that's where you have the famed man-eating tigers that move into towns and villages and eat people. So in both cases, we can see that there's behavioral variation that exists in populations before there's any sort of environmental pressure pushing them in one direction. Now, as we've said before in other video lectures, there is a genetic basis for behavior, and so the question is there a genetic basis for variation in behavior? So to study this, what scientists did is they took the case of blackcaps once again, and they investigated a little bit more deeply. Blackcaps are usually migratory birds, and blackcaps from Germany will migrate to the Mediterranean in a southwesterly direction. Blackcaps from Britain will move south towards the Mediterranean during the winter. What scientists started to notice over the last few decades is that more and more of the blackcaps in Britain were staying in Britain, or so it appeared. In actuality, what they discovered was that the blackcaps were actually not just staying in Britain, they were originating from Germany. So German blackcaps were migrating westward instead of migrating southwesterly. So what scientists did is they wanted to see if the reason for this was based on some sort of genetic component. So what they did is they took some of those birds who were wintering in Britain back to Germany. They mated the birds with each other, and they wanted to observe what would happen with their offspring. Now that they were living in Germany, would they still want to move westerly to Britain or southwesterly? And so what ended up happening was they put these blackcaps into basically a funnel, and they wanted to observe their migratory restlessness. Remember, that's when they're stuck in a cage, they want to move, and they wanted to see which direction they would head in. And what they observed was that both the parents and the offspring of the British wintering birds still wanted to move in the westward direction. So even when they were exposed to the same environment in Germany as other German blackcaps, they still showed a preference for moving westward in their migration. We've already talked about how variation exists in behavior in a population, and that variation is genetically based. So what we want to look at now is how certain behaviors can increase the chance of survival and therefore reproductive success. And one of the ideas that's come out of this is the optimal foraging theory, which basically says animals, to increase their chance of survival, will try and expend as little energy as possible in obtaining as many calories as possible. Basically, they want to pay less and get more. And so our example of this is a graphic that you see down here on the left-hand side of a crow. And what these crows have learned how to do is pick up snails, drop them, crack their shells, and get the food that's inside. So, if you're this crow, you don't want to fly very much, and you still want the snail shell to open. The more you fly, the more energy you waste at getting that food. So, if these crows flew to a height of 2 meters, it would take them over 50 times on average to break the snail shell. If they flew to 15 meters, in a couple of tries, they would break the shell. The problem with both of these, if you're looking at the left-hand side, is that you've got to fly many times to 2 meters to get that shell to break. Even though you only have to fly a couple times to get the shell to break at 15 meters, the bird is still flying 15 meters high. And so what you can see with the dotted line is that the total amount of flying time is quite high. These birds can expend very little energy and get the maximum reward by, on average, flying a height of 5 meters. If they fly to 5 meters, they can usually break the shells in only a couple tries, and they don't expend that much energy flying to that height. Also, behavior can be affected by the risk of predation. If you don't get eaten, you have a greater chance of survival and passing on your genes to the offspring and everything else that's related with reproductive success. So, in the case that you're looking at on the right, what you can see is where deer spend their time in relation to predation risk from mountain lions. So if you look at the left-hand side, you can see that deer spend a majority of their time in open meadows. And the reason why they spend most of their time in open meadows is because the risk of predation is low. By spending their time there, they have a greater chance of survival and therefore reproductive success. So it's more likely that if that behavior is rooted in its genetic code, that those genes will be passed on to successive generations. The question sometimes is, well, why doesn't it spend more time inside of the forest if the risk of predation is also low inside of the forest? And the reason is that to get from the open meadow to the interior of the forest, they have to cross through the forest edge where the risk of an ambush is quite high. In the natural world, there are 3 primary mating systems. They are promiscuity, which is when both individuals of the opposite sexes mate with many other individuals of the opposite sex. You've got monogamy, when both individuals are only going to mate with each other throughout their lifetime. And you've also got polygamy, which is when individual of one sex will mate with several of the opposite sex. Now, there are reasons why these behaviors have evolved over time. For example, in birds, it's often very difficult for just the female bird to provide enough food for her chicks. And so, if the male helps out, the chance of survival for those chicks drastically increases, which means that the male is going to stick around for a lot longer if it improves the genetic fitness of his children. Or we can take the case of mammals. Most mammals feed their young just with breast milk, and because of this,
the female is the most important provider of food for her children and the most important factor in their survival. So if the male isn't really that important in the children's success, he won't stick around for very long. The exception to this, or the sort of way when this pattern deviates in mammals, is when the male is responsible for protecting a large number of females, such as the case in lions. Another factor that can be important is whether the male can be certain that the children are his or not. In the case of external fertilization, like the picture you see on the top left, the male fertilizes the eggs once they're already in the water, so he knows those are his young, and therefore there's a greater evolutionary incentive for him to be around those young and to protect them so that his genes are able to be passed on for generation and generation. In the case of internal fertilization, it's a lot more difficult for the male to be entirely certain that the children or offspring are his. And so there are certain behaviors that the male will try and have in order to make sure that, in fact, the female is pregnant with his sperm. So this could be, for example, protecting the female, trying to take out potential sperm from a previous mating event, or by making sure that a large number of his sperm is inside of the female. So mate preference by females could have a large role in the evolution of male behavior. An example of this was studied in zebra finches, where scientists added a red feather to the top of both parents' heads when the chicks were young. And what they wanted to see is if the red feather at a young age on the parents would influence the mate choice of the females later in life. What they found out was that, in fact, when the red feather was placed on the female parent or on neither parent, the mate preference stayed the same for the female offspring. But when both parents were outfitted with a red feather, or just the male was outfitted with a red feather, when the females reached sexual maturity, they displayed a mating preference for zebra finches that had a red feather attached to them. So this is one way that you can see how imprinting at a very young age in the female can determine how she chooses her mate. So how she chooses her mate will then therefore influence the behavior of the males. So what you can see is that behavior in one sex is influencing the behavior in another sex. Just as female mate choice can influence the evolutionary behavior in males, the competition between males can also influence the evolution of behavior. So, for example, if there's competition between males for territory or food or mates, certain types of behavior might allow them to get access to whatever that limited resource is. And this is where you get behaviors such as agonistic behaviors. An example of this could be the antelope in the picture in the bottom left-hand corner. They're in a contest, butting horns, and the idea is that the winner of this contest will perhaps be able to mate with the female. Now, the males that are more aggressive have a better chance of winning. And so because of that, males that are more aggressive have a better chance of mating and having offspring and passing on those aggressivity genes. And so through the competition between males, you have the evolution of behavior.